Hello, John.
Hey, Nathan.
So I'm sitting here about to make a monstrosity. I'm gonna make a quesadilla, but I'm gonna put pepperonis on it, so it's like a pizza.
Dope. Nothing like a good, I guess you can say, redneck style pizza. What does this button do? Or so is this Mr. French's meeting, or there he is. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning.
You need a shave.
Yeah, how you guys doing today?
I'm tired. I just woke up.
Recording going. And good morning, everybody. It's good to see you. It's good to have you here. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and get started. If we go over here to the calendar, I think it's thinking about it. You can see today we're going to be going over exhaust and EFI systems, and next week we'll be going a little heavier into EFI tuning. So we'll go ahead and get started with this. I'll switch over. Let's see, I need to open that up. And we'll switch this over to we'll switch this over to the PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. Can you guys see my PowerPoint on the screen now?
Yes.
Yes, with the MR2 with the jet.
Yeah, it looks like an MR2 there with big exhaust jet turbine exhausts. A pretty crazy picture I found, and I'm like, well, I have to put that one in the presentation.
That's a Photoshop, right?
I think it's real. Like in some ways it looks Photoshop, but in other ways, like down here, it looks real. But I have no idea. Why would you do that to a MR2 chassis? I have no idea. But sometimes where there's a will, there's a way. Some things that people create don't necessarily have to make sense.
I don't even think there would be a purpose to it.
Hey, there's not a lot of purpose to a lot, but the purpose for our exhaust systems is just this, right? Remove exhaust gases from each cylinder as effectively as possible, and of course keep those noise levels down. And in a stock application, we could also add on here, if I throw my text box up, it would be to reduce exhaust emissions, right? I.e. our catalytic converter.
So we cut off the cat and the muffler and run boom tubes.
So there's all kinds of in the smog world, we call this after treatment. And what this after treatment does is allows us to lower the emissions. In our late model diesel engines, there's extensive after treatment systems. on a modern, let's say you buy a new F-250 or Chevy 2500 pickup truck with their diesel engine, there's you know, probably about a $7,000 to $10,000 exhaust system on that thing because it has so much after treatment in there. So so that's the job of our exhaust system, right? Let those exhaust gases out of there, reduce noise levels, maybe clean up the exhaust a little bit. And if we do it right, we get complete removal of exhaust gases from the combustion chamber. However, if we end up with incomplete removal of the exhaust gases, we're going to lower volumetric efficiency, right? Because those exhaust gases will end up taking up space inside the combustion chamber, and that is going to limit how much fresh air-fuel mixture that you can bring in to the engine. Nowadays, this effect is actually done purposely for what would be basically an internal EGR effect. And so EGR stands for exhaust. And what we're trying to do is to do just what I've described here, limit how much air-fuel mixture can enter the engine by keeping some exhaust gases in the combustion chamber. And that's going to limit the temperature of the exhaust. And they're trying to get that temperature to stay below 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. And by limiting the temperature, it's going to help limit oxides of nitrogen gas emissions. So it's something that we've done on cars since the 1970s with EGR valves. But with today's variable valve technology, like we were talking about variable valve technology last week, we could do this by modifying the valve timing and purposely making some exhaust gases hang out in there.
On the engine power show that you had us watch,
Yeah.
on one of the later episodes when they were working on that same LS engine,
Yeah.
they did work on the exhaust headers with ceramic coating.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, they do all kinds of cool stuff. So it sounds like we got you sucked into that engine power show.
Yeah.
It's not bad. I mean, there's a little bit of a sales thing, but it's not bad. They definitely do some cool stuff. That would be a cool job to have.
Yeah, I thought it was cool that they did it entirely just from like a Summit catalog.
I did too. Like, and so if you go on Summit, you can type in what build it is, and it'll give you the parts list on there of what parts and pieces to purchase and use to build exactly what they built in the show. So that's kind of an interesting setup. I like that. All right, so to turn this back to the performance standpoint, of course, we don't want volumetric efficiency being decreased. We would like all the exhaust gases to leave, and we would like those exhaust gases as they leave to help out and help bring in fresh air-fuel mixture into the engine. So before we get too far along on this, what we're going to do here is we are going to watch a quick video. If I can get this to work here. CDX video clip on exhaust systems, just to kind of
During engine operation,
fill in the gaps.
Each time the exhaust valve opens, pulses of hot exhaust gases are forced into the exhaust manifold. These hot, rapidly expanding gases produce a lot of noise, some of it at very high frequency. The exhaust system does several jobs. It has to reduce the noise of the exhausting gases to acceptable levels, and it has to discharge the gases safely, far enough away to prevent them from re-entering the vehicle. Some of these gases are highly poisonous. In an enclosed space, carbon monoxide can cause death in minutes. It is odorless and colorless, which makes it difficult to detect, and removing it is especially important. In modern vehicles, it also keeps harmful emissions to a minimum. The exhaust system is designed to enhance engine operation. A well-designed system can improve drivability and performance. In this simplified model, burned gases exit the cylinder through the exhaust port and pass into the exhaust manifold. The first pipe is usually called the engine pipe. It is connected to the outlet of the manifold, which carries the exhaust gases to the muffler, which reduces exhaust noise. Exhaust gases are then discharged through a tailpipe, usually at the rear, or sometimes to the side or above the vehicle.
All right, so I was making some notes there as we played the video. Kind of a nice little review of what an exhaust system does and what its functions are. We'll switch this back over to the PowerPoint here. Okay, and yeah, so like we just saw in the video and we were talking about, right, we would like to have complete removal of exhaust gases from a performance standpoint, right? The high pressure that's left over in the cylinder from the exhaust stroke, we call that exhaust blowdown. As soon as that exhaust valve opens up, those exhaust gases are going to rush out of the cylinder, and we can let the rush of exhaust gases out. If we time it properly, we could use that to help bring fresh air fuel mixture in to the cylinder. Okay, so what's this blowdown period? Well, it's the period between the exhaust valve opening and bottom dead center. And so that's when we're trying to get all those exhaust gases out of the cylinder. Now, if we get all the exhaust gases out of the cylinder during the blowdown period, what that means is that the piston doesn't have to start traveling upwards and force those exhaust gases out of the cylinder on the actual exhaust stroke. And what that does, not having the piston have to pump out those gases, it reduces pumping losses in the engine. It basically makes the engine more efficient, right? Instead of having to pump the exhaust gases out, we let those exhaust gases flow out on their own. And the better job we do with that, the more we help out our volumetric efficiency, or VE, and that's going to equal, not add, but it's going to equal more power in the engine, because we've made it a more efficient pump, right? Better pump. All right. So if we look at our exhaust headers, right, the exhaust manifold on a stock car basically just directs all the gases out and has them collect together. However, an exhaust header is going to be designed to decrease exhaust back pressure, right, and hopefully increase exhaust scavenging. So as exhaust gases flow out, they help other cylinders flow air fuel mixture into them. So there's a lot of technology and design into making the proper exhaust header for the engine. And then of course, the big complexity, one thing you don't see on the dyno shows that are out there, is that you also have to fit this thing inside the car, right? Fit it underneath the hood. And so the fitment, or getting this thing to fit in the space available, is a big deal. And so when it's open on the dyno, you can put whatever headers you want on there, but fitting that in the car is a different story. Okay, so I mentioned the word scavenging. And scavenging is what we've talked about, where we're using the flow of exhaust gases out of one cylinder to help bring air fuel mixture in another cylinder, right? So it functions off of compression waves as they flow out of those exhaust ports down that header. So we have a suction wave that follows the pressure wave, and then the pressure wave will reflect back down up to the exhaust valve. So a good example of scavenging and the way these pressure waves work inside the exhaust system really is a two-stroke engine. This graph here kind of shows you the valve overlap period and the pressure waves and those different exhaust waves. And if you measured the pressure pulsations in the exhaust system, but we have pressure and vacuum with each wave that flows through the exhaust. Well, a good example of an engine design that really takes advantage of exhaust scavenging and exhaust tuning is a two-stroke engine that utilizes an expansion chamber. So I know a lot of you guys have messed around with small engine stuff and mopeds and all kinds of stuff. Well, if you have a two-stroke engine and you put one of these funny looking exhaust pipes on there, this is an expansion chamber. So you can see that it starts off small, right? It starts off small and it gets bigger. It gets small again and then ends up going to a muffler or stinger on the end there. This is a great example of utilizing the harmonics to increase the engine's efficiency. In a two-stroke engine, a well-tuned exhaust system can double the horsepower of the engine. In two strokes, we often say that this exhaust system and its shape is the equivalent to different camshafts in a four-stroke engine. So
wouldn't wrapping the exhaust also create a scavenging effect?
What wrapping the exhaust does is it helps keep the heat in the exhaust and not radiate out to everything else. And so in theory, if we keep the exhaust out hot, it helps the gases keep high velocities as the heat increases their expansion, so it helps them flow out better. But it's not a huge effect. Oftentimes when you wrap the exhaust, probably the horsepower gain that you're seeing from wrapping that exhaust is more related to lowering the underhood temperature so that the air going in the engine isn't as hot than it is actually by improving the exhaust flow. Case in point, in my kart engines, we wrapped the exhaust and I wasn't able to notice any difference in lap time or horsepower between a wrapped exhaust and an unwrapped exhaust. And so in the classes where we could wrap the exhaust, we would. If nothing else, it kept you from burning your kart suit on the exhaust system, getting in and out of the kart, but didn't really see too much of a horsepower improvement. But on those engines, the exhaust and intake were so open and you didn't have the problems where you're heating up an underhood air. But in theory, yes, Nathan, by wrapping the exhaust, it should help improve flow and power out because it keeps the exhaust velocities a little higher because we're letting the heat help us work these exhaust gases out. Good comment there. I'm going to clear these drawings. So we have a suction. Oops, that was a terrible line. We have a suction wave there that is what we're trying to do is harness that suction wave to pull in air fuel mixture. And then of course, as these waves reflect back and forth, they get weaker and weaker. I go back to my mouse here and I click this guy. Let's see if we can get the, uh-oh. We lost the PowerPoint, that's okay. What we're gonna do is we're gonna share the screen. And I want you to look at this guy right here. So here's an example of a two-stroke engine. And what I like about this example is that it shows you the pressure wave reflections. Now in a two-stroke, that reflection actually, as you can see by the green here represents the fuel. It reflects the fuel and pushes it back inside the combustion chamber. And that's why it's such a huge impact on a two-stroke engine, but you can see they're utilizing the pressure reflection on that design, and that's why we have a divergent cone and a convergent cone that reflects the exhaust gases back. In four-stroke engines, we're usually just trying to diverge the gases out and have a smooth flow out of the engine. Things do get more complicated though as I add other cylinders and I'm trying to feed them all into a single exhaust system, right? Because now I have different exhaust pressure waves colliding with each other. All right, so let's switch this back to my screen. I'm going to close him out. I'm going to open up our PowerPoint again. And switch it to the PowerPoint. Okay. Let's see if we can get back to where we were now. So we were talking about scavenging, right? And if we do this right, we will scavenge exhaust gases out and have it help us increase the volumetric efficiency of the engine a little bit, right? So I have here to fully scavenge one cylinder, the suction waves must be harnessed during the valve overlap, right? So by using the third harmonic, basically as we're utilizing one pressure wave flowing out, hopefully we can use that to draw in another pressure wave. And you can see where all these exhaust header pipes come together is critical, the distance between these two, because that's going to impact the pressure wave strength and how the gases and waves get reflected back to the exhaust valve of the engine. Okay, so optimize header primary length. That length is what I was referring to here with the distance between the collector here where all the pipes come together and where it bolts to the cylinder head. So generally speaking, longer primary tubes, they're going to give more time between pressure reflections, lowering the RPM at which the suction wave is utilized, right? So the longer the primary tubes, the more it's going to help the low end of the power spectrum. Shorter primary tubes are again going to raise this RPM. So this is something to think about as you're selecting what set of exhaust headers do you want to have. Well, not only do you have to function on, you know, what can I actually fit underneath the hood of the car, but, you know, where do I want my power? The longer these tubes are before they converge together, the more it lowers the power in the RPM spectrum. The shorter it is, the more it's going to work more towards the higher RPM end of the spectrum. Okay, so ideally, the exhaust header and exhaust system design must match the purpose of the engine, right? And so we can see all kinds of different pipes here, from 421s to ones that are ceramic coated, to polished, to race headers, to stainless steel. The nice thing about coating your headers is they don't get all rusty. They tend to last longer. They also tend to hold that heat in there better, which can, you know, slightly improve performance.
I know there are some misconceptions about the cons of wrapping exhaust, because I know some people will say it makes them deteriorate quicker, but I'm pretty sure that people just don't, like, they have like a small opening and the air gets in and moisture just wreaks havoc on it.
Yeah, I mean, I've found that no matter how well I wrap stuff, it is hard, especially if you're someone who you clean your engine on a regular basis. It's hard to not get moisture trapped in there, and it does tend to rust them out sooner. That being said, you know, the amount it lowers the underhood temperatures and everything else, it's usually worth it if you take a header that's already polished or ceramic coated, and then maybe add wrap to that. You're not going to have the corrosion problems as if you're wrapping an unfinished header. At the very
You
least,
could also seal off the ends of silicone so no air can get in.
yeah, I find that no matter what it says on the tube of silicone, that usually ends up burning off. But you know, you have to just try different things and figure out what works with you. A racer competitor friend of mine told me once that he looked at his exhaust system almost as a consumable item, kind of like a set of tires, knowing that eventually he's going to have to change that thing out of there, and just budget for that, right? Whether you're going to end up going off track and scraping the bottom of the exhaust system on a part, or it's going to end up rusting out, or other failures or broken bolts. That's how he approached it, and that's probably the right way to go there, because it seems like no matter how hard I try, eventually my exhaust system gets some issues with it. So, all right. So we were talking about that collector. Here's a good shot of the collector, right? The distance between where that collector is and the exhaust valve. That's that head pipe, and of course, there's tuning involved there, not only in the length, but then what's the diameter of your collector, right? So large diameter collectors allow the initial portion of the scavenge wave to be the strongest, right? While smaller collectors have the opposite effect on that. So not only is the diameter of the tubing important, the size of the collector is important, and all these pieces are really made to be working together. And so you have to know, like, what am I trying to do with this exhaust system, and what am I trying to do with my engine, and does my exhaust system complement that? So here's a totally different design collector with a real big housing area, right? So it's going to broaden that expansion wave, but it diminishes the strength. So it's going to give you a broader power band, if you will, but it may not improve the volumetric efficiency as much as one that would improve it in a narrow section. Again, what I find realistically, a lot of what you do with your exhaust system comes down to what can I actually fit underneath the hood and underneath the chassis of my car. So a lot of these slides make stuff sound really great, but unless it's just on an open dyno or something, you have the logistics of actually fitting things underneath the hood of the vehicle. All right, here's one that I do really want to get into, and that is back pressure, right? Inefficient, and I use that word on purpose, inefficient exhaust systems, they'll allow back pressure here to build up or be bottled up in the exhaust system and bottle and pressure back up to the cylinders, right? And of course, that's going to reduce the amount of air fuel that can enter the engine, right? That's going to reduce its ability to scavenge. And so here we're taking out the oxygen sensor and installing a back pressure gauge. I've had cars that had so much exhaust back pressure, the engine wouldn't even fire up and run. It would start and kind of fire for a second and shut right off because this thing would build up so much pressure in here. It couldn't bring in any fresh air fuel mixture because you couldn't get any air fuel mixture out. I've had other cars where you would accelerate and the power level, it'd start to accelerate and the power level would just fall on its face as it built up exhaust back pressure. So the best way to see how much back pressure you would have would be to actually tap into the exhaust system like we're doing here and install a back pressure gauge and measure that back pressure. Ideally, I like to see 0 back pressure, but in a factory exhaust system, you might see a 1/4 PSI, maybe a 1/2 PSI as you rev up the engine. And certain vehicles with, especially those with back pressure EGR valves, might be designed for a certain amount of exhaust back pressure to make that EGR system work. But ideally, performance standpoint, I don't want a bunch of exhaust back pressure in there. Go ahead.
I know some of the arguments against like straight piping a vehicle is that it removes back pressure, but it's not really necessary though on a bigger vehicle. Maybe on like a dirt bike, yes, but not on something like this, like a car or something.
Well, so on the two-stroke engines, they utilize the pressure reflections, but they don't necessarily want exhaust back pressure. There are some vehicles, mainly those with what I have right here on the screen, that have back pressure EGR valve, where this valve, in order for it to work correctly, needed to have a certain amount of exhaust pressure that would basically close an air bleed inside this EGR valve. They needed a certain amount of exhaust back pressure to get this device to work properly. However, from a performance standpoint, I really don't want any exhaust back pressure. And to illustrate that concept, I want to take you to our Canvas page, and I want you guys to look at our latest discussion. Okay, so if I go to the discussions tab and we look in here, we have all kinds of stuff. We have, and this should just opened up this morning, an episode of Engine Masters. And unfortunately, I mean, this is the only episode of Engine Masters you can watch for free, because everything they want you now to pay a bunch of money for on Motor Trend On Demand. And I like Motor Trend On Demand until they started like double billing me, and they screwed my account all up. So I had to close it out, and I have boycotted them since then. But they have some pretty decent programming on there. This is one of their better shows that I really like. Well, this particular episode is on YouTube, and it's perfect because it matches in exactly with what we're talking about. And so in this episode, they test a 2.5 or 2.5 inch exhaust versus a 3-inch exhaust, right? With the idea that if the 3-inch exhaust is larger, it should lower back pressure. The basic argument here with exhaust systems is you'll hear these things, Nathan, just like you said, is that you'll hear people say, oh, I need back pressure. I need a little bit of back pressure. And you'll also see that, oh, if it's too big, kind of like when we talked about the carburetors and stuff, right? Too big, it's going to lower air velocity, and that's going to lower the flow and lower the speed. So these guys are trying to play out some of these myths on exhaust systems, and they do a pretty good job with that in this episode. So what I want you guys to do is answer these questions here about, watch the episode and answer a few questions on what you think. And it's not really, there's not necessarily right and wrong questions here. I mean, this is a video clip I would have had us watch in class anyways. And we would have just had the same discussion in class. But it's definitely something to look at. And one thing to notice, they always, in this show, they always talk about the camshaft specifications, like we were talking about last week, lift and duration. And anyways, this is something I'd like you guys to look at to kind of answer these questions. My general feeling is that I don't need a bunch of exhaust back pressure on there. So if I go back to our PowerPoint, and unless I have an EGR valve, and actually I did have the case, remember guys, that before I was a teacher, I was a smog tech, and I actually used to teach the smog class. And I actually experienced during that time as a smog diagnostic tech, where we put on a really good exhaust system and then the car failed for oxides of nitrogen or NOx emissions. And the thought was that this particular car was a Camaro. It had one of these types of EGR valves. We lowered the exhaust back pressure. That meant that this EGR valve didn't work properly anymore. And the EGR valve's job is to lower NOx emissions. So in that case, we ended up having to do some finagling to get it to work correctly with that exhaust system. The exhaust system was legal, like it was CARB approved. CARB, by the way, that stands for the California Air Resources Board. So it wasn't approved. When you're buying aftermarket parts and they're going to be on a car that has to be smogged and on the street, you want those parts CARB approved. It was a CARB approved exhaust system, but after we put it on, then the NOx emissions were too high. Anyways, if I have one of these EGR valves, yeah, I need a certain amount of exhaust back pressure to make that sucker work. However, if I don't, or if I'm just purely concerned with performance, I probably don't want any exhaust back pressure. And so I want you guys to watch that video on YouTube, the Engine Masters, and see what they find in their test results. Now, port flow velocities, right? They're impacted by the port area and the piston speed. Okay, now if the port size is too large, the pressure waves that are going to happen inside there are going to be reduced. So that's going to affect your exhaust tuning again. So when you're shopping for cylinder heads, they're going to say, okay, well, this, the intake ports are so many cc's, the exhaust ports are so many cc's, and again, that all affects the tuning because how the gases flow into and out of the engine, the port size, this volume here, has an impact on that. All right. So port sizing actually has a greater impact than the header tube lengths, right? So this is why we can get a much bigger bang for the buck oftentimes with our cylinder heads with different size ports than we can have with the rest of the exhaust system. Once we have a decent flowing exhaust system, you can't correct for a poor exhaust port, right? So if you have some really restrictive stock heads, even if you put a good exhaust system on there, you're not going to see that full benefit. I think is a better way to look at that, right? It's kind of like, polishing a turd. No matter how much you rub on it, it's still a turd. So, but likewise, if you put some really good heads on the car, but you had that stock exhaust manifold, you wouldn't realize the full value of those heads. Those parts need to work together. We're trying to shoot for, from a performance standpoint, over 600 feet per second to give us good exhaust flow and good scavenging inside the engine. Okay, for you math guys out there, here Nathan was giving me different equations last week. We got one here for you. If you want to figure out your minimum area for your port size, you could do that by this equation. So what you would do is you take the RPM that you want to run and the stroke and bore of your engine, multiply that all together, divide it by 190,000, and that would basically tell you the minimum exhaust port cross-sectional area. So what would this do? It would basically help you buy the right heads, right? You would know what your stroke is. You would know, hey, I want to be able to turn 7,000 RPM on this engine, and you know what your bore is, and then you can work your way backwards to figure out, okay, well, how much exhaust port area do I need? Now, the results are a little smaller than ideal, but this gives you good streetability, I call it, right? If you desired more performance from there, you could always port the heads to enlarge that area to increase the outflow. Okay. So back to the headers. Remember, it's the primary tube length, which I have outlined right here. This length, you know, is a big impact on torque. And this is an impact whether it's a 2-stroke engine or a 4-stroke engine. In fact, in our 2-stroke engines, we'll change the length, we call it flex length, to control the power of the engine. And remember, the longer it is, the more it's low RPM. The shorter it is, the more it's high RPM. And we have little inserts that we can put in our exhaust system to control that length. Anyways, that does also affect back pressure, and it affects where our peak torque is going to be realized in the engine, right? So picking the right set of heads and then the right exhaust manifold or header to go with those heads is important. And this is where you'll see people talk over and over. They got a lot of really good parts, but the parts are mismatched, and the engine doesn't make good power because of that. Okay. So shorter lengths added torque above the peak torque RPM point, longer lengths lower that. Anyways, I've kind of already said this before. It's an impact of the length and the diameter of the tubing. I feel like I'm kind of killing you with that. Now, again, another math formula. If you wanted to figure out, well, what should my header pipe length be, right? And this type of stuff is valuable for the person they're going to build their own exhaust system. They're going to design their own headers and weld those up. Well, having this information would help them make those decisions.
Charlie has a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Let me get the chat up. Let's see, where the heck did that? Let's see, breakout rooms, remote control. Why don't I see? Oh, there it is. Gosh darn. Let's see here. Leaf blower. Okay. Well, okay, so the question's about if you take the spark plug out, the leaf blower spins really freely. When you put it in, it barely moves. Remember that without the spark plug, there's no compression in the engine, so it should move very easily. When you put it in, now it's gonna have compression, so it should be harder to move. That being said, if you think you have a blocked exhaust, the easiest thing to do on a small engine, whether it's on a motorcycle or a leaf blower or whatever, take the exhaust off of there. In fact, let me switch this over to let's see, let me switch this over to just the camera here. So I'm going to go to my screen and let's see, how do I want to just make myself big here. I don't know. Can you guys see me on your computer screens? Because what I'm going to do is hold up an engine that I have sitting right here. you could always take the exhaust system off, the muffler off of that thing, like I've taken it off of this engine right here, and see how it spins. See if it runs noticeably better. Because two-stroke engines make a considerable amount of exhaust carbon buildup, they do tend to get clogged up, and that does reduce their power. Also, in a two-stroke exhaust, although I know you guys, oh, let me grab that. I know it might be hard to see in here, but it's a great way to figure out the condition of the engine. Take that exhaust off, look inside the exhaust port, and you can see the piston. And if the piston is all scratched up, it tells you, hey, it's time to rebuild that thing, right? So I find that to be even better than doing a compression test, because it really allows you to see what the wear is on the piston and cylinder. So that would be my my recommendation, is just take the exhaust off, look at the piston. You can see how much wear is there, and also see, does it want to fire up now. He notes down that the fuel was like maple syrup. Yeah, it sounds like it sat too long, and the fuel went bad, and that's pretty common. So we see that quite a bit. All right. So not that you guys have to memorize this formula or anything. I don't have this stupid thing memorized, but what I do want you to know is that there are calculations that you can use if you were going to build your own exhaust system, if you want to figure that stuff out. Here would be some of the tools and tech to do that. They make this almost like snap together exhaust system parts where you can determine your bends and everything else to design your own header and figure out your own header length. Now, one thing you'll notice about the headers is that some of them look kind of weird, and what they're trying to do here is they're trying to have each one of these headers be the same length, right? So that you don't have some cylinders running differently than other cylinders, right? So using the formula on the previous slide, we put in 6,000 RPM, 55 degrees, it would need a primary length of 33.3 inches. So let's say that that's what we wanted our header length to be. Well, if I'm trying to cram 33.3 inches for each one of those, what has to happen is the cylinder that is physically closer to the collector, right? I have to make its guy come out and loop and act, be a little bit more crazy looking, where this one's more straight through there, so that these all end up with the same length, the same measurement. That being said, there is some header designs and some intake designs too, where instead of making everything the same, they'll purposely have different header lengths with the idea that it will broaden the engine's power range. In that, let's say this gives good power at 6,000 RPM with this length, but if I want good power at, let's say, 4,000 RPM, I need, let's say I need 38 inches. So I need something a little bit longer there, right? 5 inches longer. Well, what I could do is I could then take this and make a couple of these guys, longer here than other ones. And so you would have two cylinders working better at a lower RPM level than other cylinders, and you wouldn't make the same amount of maximum power, but you should make solid power over a wider RPM range. If you look at some old Formula One cars and stuff, that would have separate carburetors here for every cylinder in the engine sitting on top of the intake manifold. Let's see, I'll put one more here. A lot of those engines would have on them what they would call a velocity stack. So it would be almost a tube that looks like that, and you might see some of the velocity stacks were taller than other velocity stacks. And the idea was that the velocity stacks would help a certain amount of ram airflow at RPM levels. Well, if you made them different lengths, that would help at slightly different RPMs. And again, it would broaden the engine's power range. So you wouldn't have the same high max power, but you would have more power over a wider range. Anyways, the length of this stuff comes into play. The formulas that I shared on there, you can use those to figure out what the ideal length would be. And there's a lot of race car fabricators that, due to maybe what's available for their car or the configuration of it, they're building their own exhaust header system. And so those things come into play as they can put the stuff, as they need to put something together that's going to work properly in the car. All right. So primary tube length, again, what is it going to do? It's going to determine the amount of torque you have above and below your peak torque value of your engine, right? So you can tune your power for more below the, more lower in the RPM spectrum, or higher in the RPM spectrum. Okay. Normally speaking, you would want your primary tube length equal from cylinder to cylinder, right? And we were just talking about that. You do end up with a peakier torque curve when you do that, right? Because everything's going to be working together at the same level. But there is also manifold designs that don't have that on purpose to broaden the range, right? So here would be an example of that, an unequal length header. And notice that packaging wise, this system obviously packages together much better, because I don't have to have this tube coming out and coming back and trying to get equal length to that guy right there. So from a packaging perspective, this is cleaner. The tubes are all bent really nice. They're probably a better size than the original manifold. So it probably still flows a lot more than the stock exhaust manifold. But you're not going to make the same amount of peak power. You are going to get, though, something that maybe fits a little bit better and is going to give you a broader torque curve, right? But the peak is going to be less. So again, it depends. What do you want to do with this engine, right? What are your physical constraints of what you can fit? Okay. So unequal length primary tube headers, physical restrictions, all these things I've kind of beat you up about before, so I'm going to skip through that. Again, the diameter of the tube affects the engine RPM where the peak torque is created. The idea is that a smaller diameter, right, if this is my, not drawn very well, but let's say this is my header tube, the smaller diameter, let's say the 2-inch, is going to provide higher flow velocity, right? More speed and better scavenging at the lower RPM. The bigger diameter, if I move this thing up to 3 inches, well, it's going to provide higher volume, more flow, and so it should raise the peak RPM of this thing, right? So that's kind of the theory. Remember that some of the stuff doesn't always work out according to the theories when you actually put it in the vehicle, right? Because you have a whole length of the whole exhaust system on the whole vehicle, and how long is the vehicle, and what are your packaging constraints. But, you know, in theory, smaller diameter, think of that carburetor venturi, the air velocity stays up, and so it should help more of the low RPM. Bigger diameter would take away the low power, but it would give you a lot more power up high, and it depends on what you want to do. Again, the Engine Masters episode is really interesting because this is exactly what they're trying to test out. This theory, they're trying to test this out in the episode. So I'm excited to have you guys watch it and to get your comments back on it. Okay, like everything else, there are formulas for all this stuff. And maybe you're sitting there and you're like, man, this is a good formula. I don't know, I have time to write all this stuff down. This presentation is on the presentations list in our Canvas website page. So you guys have copies to this. But yeah, there's formulas to figure out, well, what do I want for my header tube, not only length, but what do I want for my head pipe diameter? Here's some good power curves that you can see as we're increasing the head tube diameter, right? How it starts changing the peak torque. So in this example here, what you can see is we have different sizes that range from 1.5 primary tube diameter to 1 7/8, and how it affects the peak power and also where it comes in. Obviously, the smaller one, it does have a noticeable improvement right there in the power curve, but then after that, it's down and out, right? So it's trying to find that compromise. If you look at it from these test results, what you would see is, well, this purple one, that 1 7/8, yeah, it's got the same low right here, but it actually was a little stronger right there, and it comes up and makes more power over there, but it loses it in the middle. So again, you have to think about, well, what am I going to do with this engine? Where am I going to be running this engine? All right. So you can see the different steps here and how everything's put together. And there's a lot of technology into an exhaust system. So each primary tube very well may have more than one diameter if you're going to a step design, right? So they might start out large and get smaller, or they commonly start out small and get larger. And they're trying to take advantage of that expansion wave, much like we would in a two-stroke exhaust system. Okay. So here we have one that goes from 1 3/4, then steps down to 1 5/8, where the exhaust begins to cool. The idea is that we're trying to keep up exhaust system velocities. All right. We've talked a little bit about reversion when we looked at the two-stroke engines. You know, ideally these step tube headers, the idea is that they're trying to broaden out that torque curve in the engine. All right. Well, what about bends and dents and stuff? Believe it or not, these dents, they didn't happen from crashing into stuff. These are dents that somebody put into these headers trying to get them to fit in the car, trying to clear your steering column and maybe some of your other bracketry or the fender wells or suspension components. Oftentimes you'll see guys take a perfectly good set of headers and start beating them up to get them to fit in the car. As I said here, any constriction will increase exhaust restrictions, which should decrease flow. if you happen to have the paid subscription to Engine Masters, they actually do an episode on this where they take some nice headers and beat the tar out of them and make them look like this right here and test them on the dyno. And what they find is you got to have some pretty big dents before you noticeably start to measure power output being dropped down. That being said, that just looks terrible, but I've had to do it in some cases. So, yeah, not ideal, but you can get away with a little bit of massaging of those headers if you need to get them to fit. All right. So again, to kind of summarize things, I'll get you here in just a second. To summarize things, the collector length has an effect on scavenging. So does the header length, and of course the diameter of everything. And usually what we say here is that short is more for high RPM, long is good for lower RPM. All right, let's see what's going on in the chat here. Yeah, so banging them up, yeah, it's I thought any bangs, like any dents in there, would affect it. On that particular episode of Engine Masters, what they tested on that engine was that they really had to beat the tar out of it before it was noticeably dropping off power output. But I will say that every engine's different, right? You could have a different engine that is a lot more affected by some dents in there. So if you do need to, let's say, clearance some headers to get them to fit, I would try to do something where I'm doing the minimal amount of disturbance to the headers to get those things to fit properly.
I mean, you could also have an older vehicle with a very large engine bay that'll fit any headers.
Yeah, that would be something. And so you have to kind of, you know, decide, well, what do you want to modify? The biggest thing that I see is on the driver's side of the engine, you're trying to clear. You have the steering box here and the steering column that you're trying to clear. And so those exhaust headers oftentimes want to come out and get entangled with that. And so it's these two components that you're usually fighting, is the exhaust headers and that steering box. And you're pretty limited on what you can do with that steering box, unless you want to get radical and put, let's say, rack and pinion steering in there or something. So yeah, electric power steering, that would be a way, and that is getting more and more popular. But for years and years, guys on the cheap, they would kind of beat their headers into position to get them to fit properly. And you know, I don't know. I've never done it and then been able to notice the difference driving it. But you know, every engine's going to be a little different. All right. Yeah, electric power steering is definitely the way to go, and I'm seeing it used more and more in autocross cars and in race cars and stuff. Then again, remember, if you're using electric power steering, there is components that got to be properly set up to that, and your charging system has to have enough output to run it. So nothing's easy, right? Everything's a compromise. So look at this collector, right? Here's an awesome collector that's made for very high flow, and you can even see that from the collector, then it expands out again. That's an open collector that you'd use in drag racing. So one kind of you know, old school method of determining, okay, well, you know, how long should my collector length be, right? Now, when we say collector length, what we're talking about now is the distance between here and here, where everything comes together, right? How long should this distance be? Well, you could take yourself a grease pencil and mark along this thing, right? The point where the marking melts, where all these gases come together and get really hot, let's say it melts right there. Oops. I'll try that again. Let's say melts and it ends up stopping there, that would be where you'd want that collector. That's where you'd want them to come together. So, sorry guys. So with that, this type of header system, like these parts all are interchangeable. Like you can take those headers, you can take the collector off, you could slip another one on. And so you can see it's all clamped and wired together. So at the drag strip, you could change those parts and change the tuning of the exhaust. Very similar to what we do on our goat carts. They're held together with spring clamps and stuff. And that allows you to adjust it for the race day conditions. All right, so the collector size diameter, remember, smaller, more low RPM, larger collector, it's gonna flow more and it's more high RPM. You kind of see that theme, right? Smaller is more about keeping velocities up at low speed. Higher's all about maximizing flow, and that's gonna be more power at higher RPM levels.
Doesn't Ferrari use collectors on their exhaust system or their intake system?
Doesn't who?
Ferrari.
Well, Ferrari, they'll definitely have collectors on their exhaust system. If you think of your intake manifold design, where the throttle body comes together is essentially your collector. So again, it comes down to where that thing's placed in the intake airstream. So a lot of the things that we looked at for intake manifolds and exhaust manifolds, you see some similarities there. Where is that common feed point, right? And then how long are the runners to each cylinder? So yeah, every engine is going to have a collector point. Just on some, it's just going to be a matter of packaging, where others it's actually going to be designed for a certain length, certain size, for what power they're trying to get out of that engine and what RPM do they want their power to be delivered. So on this slide, we got our hot rod calculator there, right? For doing some of these equations, but it also, I had this note on the slip-on collectors. That's often, you see stuff like that at the drag strip as people are trying to tune their systems for the right setup for those track conditions. Okay. So again, on collectors, there's different types. There's merge collectors. I mean, we're kind of killing it, but a lot of testing and development has gone into exhaust systems to make them as efficient as possible. And so there's different ways. This can all dump together, or it can have extra baffling in here to direct the gases together. Again, trying to increase velocity, right? Now, what's funny with all this stuff is you know, we're largely focusing on naturally aspirated. If you go to a turbocharger, then these gases all get rammed together as they go through the turbo. And so that dramatically affects how everything's gonna work. All right. So different styles of merged collectors with different middle inserts that you can replace in there. Pretty neat stuff. Okay, a little bit of nomenclature on here, right? Our exhaust valve closing and intake valve opening, right? Those are important points. And in between those two, that's where we have our valve overlap, right? And so that's where we're paying attention to a lot, because by utilizing that valve overlap, that gives us almost kind of like a natural supercharging effect, as we can use the exhaust gases flowing out to bring air fuel mixture into the cylinder, right? So super important piece to the puzzle there. Okay, so trying to time that and getting the timing of that to match with what the camshaft is doing, right? So that's why what camshaft you select and what its intake center line is and how much overlap it's going to have that's going to be important to know so that you can match with what the timing of the valves are doing with the exhaust system, right? So a very late exhaust valve opening is going to reduce your blowdown. It's going to increase pumping work and reduce horsepower, right? So if I can get the exhaust valve to open sooner, I can improve the power of the engine. That also will help exhaust back pressure and stuff as well. All right, so we'll clear that out, keep moving. Intake valve closing, right? It's controlling that balance point between when do we start filling the cylinders, right? Well, when does the intake valve close? Well, that's a compromise on, what are we doing with our ports and everything else. Again, the engine builders that make the most power, they're going to measure all this stuff out and calculate it by looking at their flow bench data and then selecting the right intake manifold with the right camshaft, with the right exhaust manifold. That's where you really get that combination of parts working well together. All right. So this is probably more nuts and bolts of the stuff that, hey, you guys need to know as performance enthusiasts, right? So use good quality gaskets, right? Use anti-seize on the thread of the exhaust bolts and stuff, because otherwise they're going to get all rusted together. Always follow the manufacturer's instructions. If you're using any type of high temp sealants, if there's oxygen sensors on the car or air fuel ratio sensors, you have to make sure that those sealants are sensor safe. There's a lot of sealants out there that are not sensor safe, and that means that they'll contaminate an air fuel ratio sensor, an exhaust sensor, a catalytic converter. They'll destroy those sensors inside the engine. Okay, use of the correct fasteners is really important. Here we see some exhaust fasteners that are pretty trick, because you can see that they have a slot inside here, so they can be expanded or contracted based on this threaded Allen on the inside. So what's nice about this is if you unthread the Allen, it reduces some of the pressure, and then they can unscrew and they can be locked down into place. I mean, they're pretty darn trick. Again, anti-seize is important on your exhaust fasteners. What you'll find, a lot of people, you go to work on their exhaust system and the bolts just break. They won't come out. They're stripped out. I've spent many hours torching out and cutting out exhaust bolts because they just get rusted and stuck in place. So good quality fasteners with the right compounds on them go a long ways. Okay. Traditionally speaking, if you remove that exhaust back pressure, your exhaust system is going to be louder, right? If it flows exhaust more, has less back pressure, you're going to have a louder exhaust note coming out of that thing. So performance sound reduction. Now we're going to get into the noise aspect of things. All right, so we're looking at the mufflers. Well, one way to reduce noise is to create a restriction, right? This is common in your stock vehicle applications. They'll reduce the noise, but through that, they'll make some restriction in there. And basically what's going to happen here is the exhaust gases come into the system, right? And then they're going to reflect around inside here. They'll go through a passage, they'll end up over here, and they have to diffuse through these different areas and reflect around. And as the exhaust pressure pulsations bounce around, this is what cancels the noise before it flows out of the system, right? So we're using pressure reflections as the exhaust goes through this maze to reduce the noise levels, okay?
Yeah, we don't need those, do we?
Well, I mean, you know, the reality is that, you know, you might be at a racetrack that has certain noise restraints, or you're driving it on the street, and so noise is a factor to the exhaust system. And not just
I
noise,
was gonna bring up.
how do you want it to sound
documentary.
too, right? Some people want their exhaust to sound a certain way. So how these pressure waves reflect around inside the muffler is a big deal.
On Netflix, there's a documentary called Apex. It shows a bunch of hypercars, and when Koenigsegg was testing, what track was it? I think it was one of the ones in Belgium. They got the record, but it wasn't official because they were 2 decibels above the noise restriction.
Yep. So, I mean, there you go, right? So there are certain tracks like Laguna Seca where they have very, very strict noise limits. And so you're trying to figure out how to make the most amount of power and stay within the noise levels that they're specifying. And it gets tough. It's very tricky. Racing a rotary engine is especially difficult because rotaries tend to make a pretty high level exhaust note that's really sensitive to exhaust flow. In fact, again, rotaries share many similarities with 2-stroke engines. Exhaust flow is a big deal on a rotary engine, more so than a normal 4-stroke engine. All right, so noise cancellation, right? Your Flowmaster is a great example of this, because we're using, instead of just going through a maze, we're trying to use these pressure reflections to cancel out the noise, but still have pretty decent flow as it moves out the muffler, right? And then with the angle and the shape and the size of these baffles in there, that's how we can tune the frequencies that we hear. What is the exhaust going to sound like? I guess what I don't have in this is your typical glass pack style muffler, where you would have an exhaust system that just is a tube moving straight through that has holes in it. It's perforated, right? It's got a bunch of holes in there, and then around it we have a bunch of steel wool or fiberglass packing, and the idea is that packing absorbs the noise as it flows through. The downside.
I just remembered
what
racetrack it was. It was Spa.
It was at Spa, huh?
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, and I wouldn't think that Spa would have those types of exhaust noise level restrictions, but I guess they do. I guess they have to deal with that stuff like everybody else. My whole my exhaust presentation has 1 million slides, and I left out glass packs. So Cherry Bomb's your classic design, and as you can see, it's got a straight through flow. So they flow really well. How do they work? Well, there's fiberglass insulation that's absorbing the noise levels. The downside of this style of muffler is that the fiberglass gets used up over time. So if I go back to that image right there, this fiberglass over time will burn up and the exhaust system will get louder and louder and louder. The other thing I found in my kart engines and stuff, where you could take, on this style, you have to just throw this thing away and get a new one. A lot of your motorcycle exhausts and kart exhausts, you can take this assembly all apart, repack it, and put it all back together. And so what I have found is as the fiberglass gets used up, so if I draw on this a little bit here.
Yeah, I know on the pit bike, I took it apart, pulled all the fiberglass out, and took the baffle pipe out.
Yeah.
So there's nothing in there.
Here's what we found in karting, right? And I didn't test this on a dyno, but I tested this on the racetrack with lap times, and then confirmed it with Ron Emick, because I thought I was going crazy. What I found was that over time, this insulation gets used up. It gets kind of like worn down, if you will. It's not as fluffy and as dense. And I thought, hey, if I take this insulation out of there, or if it's all used up, it's actually going to perform better. And what I found was just the opposite. When I had tightly packed the exhaust system, so I had fresh fiberglass inside here, and it was tightly packed in there, my lap times were actually faster. Not only was it quieter, but it was a little quicker. And I had mentioned that to Emmett.
It would affect the diameter of the exhaust, wouldn't it?
Well, I think what you had is the exhaust is less able to go through the perforations and then swirl around and reflect around, and it just goes straight through more. So I actually made more power, I'm assuming, because my lap times were faster, by having a well-packed muffler than one that was all rotted out. Okay, so I guess what I'm getting to is if you have a fiberglass style or cherry bomb style muffler, remember that those are consumable, and the sound absorption element in it will get used up. And you're either going to have to replace the whole thing, or if it's a rebuildable style, you'll have to repack it, and that itself will impact the power that the engine makes. And it would be kind of a fun experiment to do that in class on the dyno, and trying out different exhaust systems is fun as itself, just trying out different mufflers. So anyway.
I wouldn't recommend repacking it though, because it just, fiberglass gets everywhere.
Well, it does.
Really
yeah, wear your gloves, wear long sleeves. But if you have a motorcycle or something, that's what you do. So anyways, guys, with that, let me go back to our presentation, and my one comment on that is that, man, I'm exhausted. Right, that was a lot of stuff about exhaust systems. A couple of general rules of thumb, right? A couple general rules here. The longer, the skinnier, that's going to equal more low RPM power, right? If we go for exhaust systems that are going to be big and short, right, we're going to have a higher flow, and that should equal more high RPM power, right? It should move the torque curve up. And you could say that would apply both on the intake side and on the exhaust side, right? And again, I always...
What about like NASCAR boom tube exhausts, which are skinny and short?
Well, what they're trying to do is then find the best of both worlds, right? I like to relate this to the Venturi. That's supposed to be the Venturi inside the carburetor. And with that Venturi, right, the airflow has to speed up as it goes through there. So at lower lower engine speeds, right, that increases the velocity of the air at lower engine speeds. But at high speeds, when I need to get more air flow through here, now it's going to cause a big bottleneck in there, right? So it kind of depends on where do you want your power. I think what NASCAR is trying to do with those exhaust systems is, again, try to find that ideal compromise for what they're trying to do at that certain track or that certain type of power curve or RPM they're going to run. And that's why they'll make notes but from what parts they used at what tracks and what their setup was. So, all right. So we're not quite done for the day, but we're getting close. What I'm going to do, now I've killed you with exhaust systems, is I'm going to go to the computer screen here and we're going to close that out. And I'm going to open up this EFI presentation here. And we'll spend the last 20 minutes or so burning through some of these slides. This actually is not a very long presentation. What we're not going to go through is all the sensors today, because you can spend a lot of time on all the sensors of an EFI system. But I want to go through the basic types of EFI and some of the mechanics of programming an EFI system. So with that, we'll jump in here, okay? EFI tuning really got super popular, or there was a lot of attention drawn to it in the early 2000s, right? Made super popular by movies and TV. Here we have Fast and the Furious here. I have here, the reality of this is that in modern motorsports, modern cars are going to have fuel injection system on them. And so that largely means that you're going to be having to mess with EFI tuning to get the most performance from those vehicles. With that, you know, EFI tuning's a powerful way to increase the vehicle's performance. And what's nice about it, once you understand what you're doing, you can make changes by tapping a few keys on the keyboard here. You can do that a lot faster than you can change carburetor jets and other things. So although the system is more complicated, there's more parts and pieces to it, the adjustability of it is very, very powerful.
On the engine show that you had watch, I know he tuned the fuel at what RPM the injectors would put more fuel in to help out the power.
Yeah, yeah.
That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty darn interesting. And like I said, once you get it all set up, so where I say is EFI, it's hours and hours of setup, right? The carburetor, you bolt it on and you can fire it up and get it running. EFI is much harder to initially get running oftentimes. So the setup is a lot more complicated. But then once it's set up, different tuning changes. I want a little bit more timing here or a little bit more fuel there become a lot easier than changing carburetor jets or adjusting accelerator pump linkages or things like that. So here's my big disclaimer here with doing performance tuning, right? You really shouldn't be doing wide open throttle performance tuning on public roadways, right? This is where having an engine dyno or a chassis dyno like we see here is super important, because it allows you to be in a controlled environment where you can make those changes, really monitor to see if the engine has any knocks or pings happening, and measure the vehicle's performance accordingly. And it's just safer to do, right? You can't be looking at the computer screen and then run into somebody. That's not going to help. It's not going to help anybody out. So the basics, three basic types of EFI systems. The first one, throttle body injection, right? Where we had our fuel injectors up here in the throttle body. They would spray the fuel out right there. Kind of looked like a carburetor or a weird looking carburetor. This was popular with the OEMs. This is a GM one off of a Chevy truck. Really good, reliable system. So it was popular with the OEMs in the late 80s, phased out by the mid 90s. When Chevrolet went to the Vortex system, they moved away from throttle body. I almost rather have a throttle body system than a Vortex. Makes less power, but because the fuel injectors are all the way up here in the engine, they're not down here subject to all the engine heat. So you tend to have less injectors issues, and the system's just a lot less sophisticated, or a lot less, not sophisticated, but necessarily, but complicated, because everything's kind of in a more central location. So the fuel is delivered up top. That means that the intake manifold flows air and fuel through it. So it shares a lot of those similarities with the carburetor. All right, but you get the adjustability of fuel injection. So there definitely still is some advantages over carburation when you go to throttle body injection. And that's why you're seeing a lot of these throttle body injection kits are getting really popular. So here's a Holley Terminator EFI system. It's basically throttle body fuel injection. It has the injectors and the fuel rail in the throttle body, its own programmer, the computer. It tries to incorporate as many sensors in the throttle body assembly as it can, right? So if I got my fuel injectors in there, I got my throttle position sensor, maybe a manifold absolute pressure sensor. Then all I really need is engine temperature and RPM. Makes for a pretty clean fuel injection install.
I found
Most of these are
pretty
running
funny
somewhere around
typo
40
there.
PSI. The old GM throttle bodies, like I showed you in the previous picture, 15 PSI of fuel pressure, but most everything else was around 40, maybe 50 PSI. Like I said, the injector is a little bit further away from engine heat, so they have less problems getting all coked up with fuel solidifying in the injector. A lot of people will look at these systems and think of them as like a smart carburetor. But yeah, throttle body fuel injection, it's actually getting increasingly popular with all the aftermarket systems out there available today. And in some of those shows, that this is the type of system that they're using. Okay, so with that, the OEMs, by and large, are port fuel injection, and that is where we're spraying the fuel in the intake port right behind the intake valve, right? So we have our fuel rail, it connects all the injectors together. The injectors can be batch fired, meaning that they all fire or squirt fuel at the same time, or they can be sequential. What that means is if we take the firing order, right, we are going to fire the fuel injectors in their order, in their firing order, so that as that piston's moving down on the intake stroke, that's when I'm spraying the fuel inside the cylinder. That does tend to make a little bit more power when you sequential fire them, and it makes the vehicle a little bit more efficient. However, usually when you go to wide open throttle, it just batch fires everything once you get over 3/4 throttle. So when I said it makes more power, it makes more power in part throttle conditions. It makes the engine a little bit more efficient with that proper timing of the fuel. When you go wide open, everything's just on spraying, dumping fuel in the engine. All right. So that's port fuel injection. And of course, the latest evolution of that then is direct injection. And that's where this fuel injector here is directly screwed into the cylinder head, right? It's going directly into the combustion chamber. So we have combustion pressure up against the injector tip. And so the injector has to be made beefier and stronger. It also has a lot more fuel pressure going to it, somewhere between 2,000 to maybe 6,000 PSI at wide open throttle. And it has, you know, pretty big improvements in fuel economy and engine efficiency when you go to direct injection. There is safety issues, right? Safety concerns. I don't want to rip into this system if it's sitting there with 6,000 PSI in there. So you really need to pay attention to what style of fuel injection is on the vehicle before you take apart the fuel system for major service work, okay? This is also an expensive system. It requires a high pressure pump. The other thing I will say, the downside of direct injection is because we are not getting fuel moving over the backs of the intake valves, they tend to carbon up because there's no fuel there to clean them off. So we're seeing a large amount of intake valve carbon issues on DI or direct injected cars these days. So that's the downside with direct injected. A lot of your aftermarket computer systems may not be able to control a direct injected vehicle as well. So that's something to think about there from a aftermarket computer standpoint. Okay, so throttle body, port fuel, and direct injected. Now, types of tuners. Well, we have piggybacks, and piggybacks are just that. They're a little box that gets put in between the stock factory computer and your sensors and stuff, and it basically modifies those signals going in or out to adjust things. So you're not actually changing the stock computer, you're modifying signals in and modifying some signals out, okay? So a piggyback design is going to give you a limited amount of adjustment, that's for sure. But you're not changing the factory computer. Now, performance proms. Well, these gave you a fixed tune, right? You could buy a different computer chip, a different PROM, programmable read-only memory, that would be installed in the computer, and that could have different adjustments. It could have more spark advance, more injector pulse width, and to change that PROM, you'd have to remove it and put a different one in there. Okay, now, an evolution of that is getting a chip burner, where you had basically a docking station to take your PROM out and allowed you to create different tunes and reburn your PROM and then put it back in the computer and run the car. This usually required you to modify your stock ECU to make the PROM replaceable. In the case of this Honda system here, these PROMs didn't just come out of there like the GM PROMs did. So you had to actually desolder it, put in a replaceable socket so that you could burn your PROMs and then remove them, replace them from the...
Isn't that technically illegal?
It is technically illegal. The thing of it is, and Jared's Honda is a good example of this, is that, you know, back before OBD2, we basically just did what they called an MIL test on a smog check, in that we checked to see that the check engine light, that it was on when we first started the car, and then once the car was running, that light turned off. And so you could program these up so it would pass a check engine functional test, where we would check to make sure the light worked, but you wouldn't know that it was the programming was altered. So anyways, that was pretty popular, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. It doesn't give you the ability to modify things on the fly. In fact, none of these options really give you the ability to modify anything on the fly when it's on the dyno. You have to figure out what your program is and then put it in there. And so you definitely have some limitations with all these designs. Okay, so then as we moved on to OBD2, what became more popular than performance proms and things was reflashers or reprogrammers, where I could basically rewrite the program in the factory ECU. Okay, so these can be fixed, meaning that the maker and you know, everybody from Super Chips to Hypertech to now even DynoJet makes these type of reflashers, and they've already kind of figured out some programs in there. So it's like, oh, okay, well, do you want more fuel economy? Load in this one. If you want more power, load in that one. Do you want to increase your shift points? You know, load this one in there. So they can be fixed, so you have a limited number of presets or fixed tunes, or they can be, you know, fully programmable within whatever constraints the stock ECU has. So this is, again, a pretty popular setup, and it's something that I even have here in the garage. I'll get my my setup here. I have this one here from Jet, and I initially got it for my pickup truck because when I started towing, I wanted to change the shift points for towing, and I wanted to change the idle speed and just some other little things that were well within the stock computer's use. It really wasn't something that would affect the vehicle emission, but it would make it a lot more drivable. So it gives you the OBD2 connector, you have your interface box, you have your laptop cables, and you're basically modifying those parameters. You're still limited. Like, I can't go to radically different air fuel ratios or anything like that, and I have limitations on timing and different things, but there's a lot I can do with that. Now, that being said, because these systems are OBD2, on a modern smog test, the smog machine is going to check the OBD2 information. It's going to check the monitors, and on newer cars, it can even check to see what the computer calibration ID is, to see if it matches what it is from the factory. So we're seeing people are using these reflashers, these reprogrammers, and for some cars it's super common, like Subarus and other things. Well, the smog computer can look in there and see the cal ID, and if it knows that the cal ID is supposed to be, I don't know, 6796, and it's got a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 number in there, it's going to say, hey, that's not right. Somebody's been messing with this thing. Back in the day of performance proms, I used to be able to hook up my scanner and look at the prom, what they called the prom ID. And what I would find with the performance proms is the prom ID would come up and it would be a bunch of X's. And I actually had a couple cars where they were failing smog, and it had a good catalytic converter, and I had been through everything, and it kept failing for NOx. It kept failing, and I was really beating my head against the wall trying to figure out what's going on. I could tell the car had an exhaust system on it, and but I thought it shouldn't fail. And what it was is they had put a performance prom in there. It gave it too much spark advance that increased the NOx levels, and that's what was causing the failure. And I finally figured it out by looking at the prom ID on my scanner display. So anyways, modern cars that are getting smogged, if I've reflashed them and the smog machine can see the calibration ID, it'll know whether or not that thing has been reflashed. Now, everything we've talked about, these reflashers or reprogrammers, where you're reprogramming the stock ECU. If I go back here a slide and I look at my performance proms or my chip burners, none of those things could I adjust as I drove. Some piggybacks, because you're modifying stock ECU signals, some of those you could make some adjustments as you drove, but it was pretty limited. And most of us in the industry kind of feel that piggybacks, because they're so limited, piggybacks kind of stink. They're not that good. Okay, they have a very narrow window that they can do stuff in. But for the most part, these things, they can't make adjustments on the fly. They can't make adjustments as you're driving. The advantage of standalone computer systems is that you can now make adjustments as you drive. You don't have any of those factory limitations in the stock ECU. You don't have to worry about OBD2 regulations. You can do whatever you want. So Motec, Haltech, Mtron, multiple manufacturers make nice standalone ECUs, and this is the direction I went with the computer systems in our class. They're more sophisticated to learn, but from a learning perspective, you learn more on them and you can make changes instantly while it's running on the dyno and see what that does. So you can go into a cell and say, I want 2 more degrees of advance right there. And you'll see instantly the car will kind of hiccup for a second, and then it will have that 2 more degrees of advance, and you can see, does that make more power or less power? Is it pinging on the dyno now? What's going on? Here's again a shot of a piggyback ECU. So Jet was selling these, and you would just put it in place there. That's on a Chrysler, and again, it would just modify signals in or out, which would give you a modest power performance upgrade, but again, not ideal. Fully programmable systems, like you see in the computer screen right here. Hey, that should say great responsibility, not reasonability. Darn spell check. Anyways, it gives you a lot of power, a lot of adjustment that you can do. But there's a lot of stuff that you can mess up here because you're in control of everything. If you have variable valve timing, you can control when the valves are opening and closing and how much spark advance it gets. So you can really mess stuff up in a hurry if you don't know what you're doing with a fully programmable ECU is what we're getting to here. Okay. So that being said, though, because you can learn more and you can adjust stuff quicker, that's why we're, in the class, I purchased more of the fully programmable ECUs. So this Haltech right here is essentially very similar to the Haltech that I have inside the Infiniti G35. And this is this Elite little 2500 right here is what I wanted to wire into the Celica. But you can see it's pretty involved because I actually have to wire that computer into the system. Is this going to be smog legal? Not at all, okay? These are for racing vehicles only, off-road vehicles only, right? You are fully in control of all the adjustments on this type of system. So with that, in order for you to do a good job tuning this thing, you need to have good data. You need to have good data. And so
Couldn't you just change out the ECU when you go to smog it?
you could, like, so in our Infiniti at the school, we bought a Haltech that is one of their plug and play models in that I didn't have to modify the factory wiring harness. I had to add some vacuum lines and change a bracket, but basically I was able to pull out the factory ECU, put the Haltech in there, and it plugged together with very minimal modification. So with, a half hour's worth of work, you could put that factory ECU back in the car and drive it around and get it ready for smog. So you are correct. You could do that. Anyways, it takes to properly tune an EFI system, right? You're going to have good good data. And what I would recommend you do is you gather data from the stock system to make a baseline for what you're going to do with the aftermarket system. This is what I was having Merritt and her group and do on the Celica, was basically gather data, because they were going to wire in this Haltech here into that little Celica. Well, in order for us to then properly program that thing, we would have to, have a baseline data to shoot for. They do make standalone data loggers that you could wire in your system. However, most of the really good computers have some data logging ability built into the computer already. And what things will we want to look at? Well, we would want to look at short-term fuel trim, long-term fuel trim, what the load data is, engine temperature, air temperatures. Those are the types of things we would want to look at as we ran the vehicle on the dyno to know what the normal parameters were as we then go to set up what our new computer system is going to be. So here's an example of data logging where we looked at during the drive trace, we looked at intake air temperature, long-term fuel trim, short-term fuel trim, engine speed. Well, let's say you don't know what some of those terms are. Don't worry about it. Next week, we'll get into what do those things mean, okay? Also, this type of stuff, like these terms and the sensors and stuff involved, this stuff here, this is what the AT325 engine performance class is really all about. That class goes into, fuel systems, spark, but a lot of sensors and what I call CEC, or computer engine controls. All right. So we talk about, mass stands for mass airflow, and how does that sensor work and how do you test it and all that type of stuff. So like I said, an advantage of a carburetor is it's a lot simpler. It's all built into one unit there, right? When you have fuel injection, you're going to have this network of sensors, right? A network of output devices, input devices, output devices, and you have to know how those work. And one thing I will say with fuel injection stuff is we have, garbage in. That's going to equal garbage out. Right? So if one of my sensors is not giving me the right signals, that's going to affect the computer's decision and make the car run poorly, right? So all this is great when all the sensor information is good and I've done the right tune and stuff on it. Stuff gets gnarly real fast when that's not the case. All right. So again, what Jerome, Merritt, and Susan were doing on that Celica is they had our Snap-on scanner, the Verus on there, and they were trying to do dyno runs with the Verus and record data, and so we could use that data as a baseline as to when we go to program the other computer as to what do we want in there to make the thing run decently. And from there, we can modify things. So we were using this Verus scanner as a data logger, essentially. That's what they were doing in the class at that time. And so we were using the chassis dyno to do that data logging. And it's so much easier on the dyno than trying to drive the car on the street, because you can go to wide open throttle, you can go to part throttle. You really have so much more adjustability of what you can do. You're not limited by traffic or stoplights or anything else. Here's an example of an OBD2 drive style cycle, but we would do something very similar to basically test the vehicle in different speeds and different loads to gather as much data as possible to figure out what does this car need to run. Now, not all vehicles have the same computer sensors and stuff on them. And we would, you know, kind of vary our data list from vehicle to vehicle based on what the car had and what we were looking to do. But let's say this was our drive trace here, and maybe we had a freeway cruise or something in there. You know, what types of data parameters would we look at? Well, there's what at Toyota called the Big Six, and that was engine speed, engine load, which could be taken off of a map sensor, temperature, long-term fuel trim, short-term fuel trim, and let's see, speed, load, engine speed, load, temperature, long-term fuel trim, short-term fuel trim, and throttle position were their big ones. And then I always liked adding, I wanted to see what the air fuel ratio sensor or O2 sensors were doing. I always liked adding that onto my list to figure out what was happening there with that input. So those are some of your big sensors. Next week, what we'll do is we'll spend time going over these different sensor inputs and how the sensors work a little bit more to kind of give you a better idea of what we're looking at there. Okay. What I wanted to get to though was this. This will be more fun for you, and it's something that you guys can do at home if you start to play around with some ECU tuning software. So on our Infiniti G35, we have a Haltech, and their software is available for free. And I think that's a big deal. Like if I'm going to spend thousands of dollars on a computer, man, one of the big things that makes me either want to buy one or not buy one is how good is the software? If the software sucks, I don't care how good the computer is, I'm not going to want to have to tune on it, right? So most of the good quality computer systems, they'll allow you to download the software for free so you can play around with it. And what I would like you to do is do just that. Go to Haltech's website. Oh no. All right, let's try this. Let's try this again. Let's try this way. Go to Haltech's website. And I'll be posting some videos related to Haltech for us to look at. But if you go to downloads, you can download their different computers. Now, what we have in the Infiniti is a Platinum Series computer. They also have their Elite Series. There's little differences between the two, but you can download the software and then fire it up and play around with it so you can see what types of things are adjustable inside the software. So if I move this back to my screen and I go back here, one of the things I'd like you guys to do this week is download the Haltech software. I have Get Ready for the First Class quiz. Ignore that. That's for previous classes. Oops. Yeah, ignore this. Download the Haltech software, play around with that. I will, we'll go over our schedule a little bit, and I'll show you what quizzes we have here in a minute. But anyways, your homework, I'd love you to participate in that discussion. Also, download that software, play around with it. It's one of those things like as you use it, it makes more and more sense. and you'll see similarities in it between them and other designs. Why did I choose Haltech? They're a little bit more open. They have better technical, ready available support with video series and stuff. So there's all kinds of good links on there to help you play around with that software. Okay, so with that, we'll
I
clear.
did have a question about the
Yeah.
fall semester. Do you know
Sure.
when the schedule is going to be on there so I can enroll in the classes for fall?
The schedule's not up yet. I did submit it, but they're still going through some stuff. In fact, my schedule, I got the class times. I'm still trying to get instructors set up for the right classes. So some of the classes right now say, the teacher might just say be listed as staff because we're still trying to get people plugged into the right spots. And I think other departments are having similar struggles. So I believe
All right.
that schedule should be out like mid-May for the fall semester.
All right, because I know it'd be a little annoying
What's that?
to have I know it'd be a little annoying to have priority registration and not being able to register until it's already open registration.
I hear ya. I think what they'll do is they'll probably move open registration back or something if they need to. Yeah, I'm sure they will. I'm sure they will stage it. Here's one thing you guys need to be aware of, and I'm putting up the calendar just so we have a reference here. The first day of the fall semester. And let's see. Get the thing up. The first day of the fall semester will be August 22nd. So that's for our Saturday classes, right? Majority of classes will start this week of the 24th. What we're trying to do in automotive, the last schedule I turned in, is the thought was that we're hoping that the hot summer weather will essentially burn out the virus. And so we'll be able to start the semester with regular classes that have lab and everything's working smoothly. What the health officials are warning us is that when the cold and flu season comes in, that there will likely have a resurgence of the virus. And I think that will require us to go to a modified schedule. So our plan is to front load the semester, get as many classes one and done, right? Done and out of the way while we can. And then for all the full semester classes, our plan of attack is to lower the max class size to 18. And if we have to, move the class to where the lectures are online and we split the students up into two groups. So we have one group of 9 students, another group of 9 students, and we split it up so each person kind of has their own individual workstation. Even if you were in a class like, let's say, the engine repair class, well, we have 9 workbenches in there, and you could have 2 people on an engine, and one class period, student A puts in 4 pistons and rods, and the other student comes and does the other 4 or something. So it's not ideal, but that's the best plan we could come up with to keep you guys having lab.
That's another question I had.
I think they're still kind of waiting because they're still we're still waiting for other departments to get their schedules submitted. You're also going to see overall, you're going to have a 10 to 15% reduction . 10 to 15% reduction in class offerings campus-wide, okay? So for automotive, that means I had to cut 5 classes. because there's less funding available from the state to run those classes. There's not as much money that we're having to spend money on in other areas, which is understandable. And so the school is going to receive less money. That means it has to cut back how many classes it offers. Yeah, it's going to be a challenge. I expect that schedule will be up mid-May, and you know, we've tried to put together the best thing we can for you, but it's going to be a compromise. And you know, the reality is, if the virus resurges, and depending on what, I mean, it could all be a moot point again, right? We just don't know what's going to happen. So let's finish on what we can control.
Speaking of the engine repair class,
yeah,
is there any news on our group that
no.
is almost finished?
You remember, you're going to just come see me in the fall, assuming that we're having lab and stuff, and you guys are going to do your petition for credit by exam, and part of your exam will be to fire up that engine. So
okay, so do we just do our homework for the class to keep, like,
you know what, Richard
good
Tuso
grades?
will get with me. He'll give me a list of the guys need to do these things. We know that you're going to end up taking a final exam, and you're going to end up firing up that engine. I do know that you'll end up doing those two things. If there's anything else, Tuso will let me know, and we'll make it happen.
Yeah,
So
because I don't know
speaking
if we're just going to be like bare bones with the packets and the engine, or if we're going to do the
Right.
FCA work and the CDX stuff as well.
So let's
He
switch.
He wasn't too clear on it.
Right. Well, he was kind of just figuring out as we go, and it really kind of depends. So I would say don't worry about it until the fall, and we'll figure out our plan of attack then. Okay. But we do need to finish out this class this semester. So here we are. Today's the 24th. If we look on what we have left to do in the class, right? Next week, we'll continue to talk about EFI tuning. Hopefully some of you guys will have that Haltech software on your computers. We can play around a little bit with that. What I would like you guys to do is watch that, that video on the discussion on the Iron Animal, where they did the flow bench testing. And I'm also going to open up for you a general tuning knowledge exam. Okay, and you'll have a while to take this thing, but I'm going to open that exam up for you, because at that point we've pretty much talked about all the stuff for the most part that's on that thing. The following week, we're going to talk about our power adders, which is going to be turbochargers, superchargers, nitrous. Our final week, we'll talk about engine startup and break-in procedures, kind of do some review, put it all together. And then I'll also open up your other exam, which is the EFI tuner exam. So how do you find those exams? Well, if we go to our course and we go to the quizzes, you'll see these two. Like you can see, it'll open up next week. I'll go ahead and preview this thing. It has some multiple choice questions. And it's got a few short answer questions too, right? So one thing we talked about a couple weeks ago is how do you figure out the red line of an engine? How about we spent a lot of time in the beginning of our class about safely testing stuff on the dyno, different types of dynamometers. So this test will open up next week. And like I said, most everything on here we've talked about pretty well. So that's why I'm able to open it up next week. Don't forget to check out the discussions. And one of my challenges for our class in the upcoming weeks is to try to figure out how to take what we did in class and what we've been doing now in our online half, putting that together to come up with your grades. But fear not, if you've been here, you've been participating, you're going to get a grade for finishing this course. And any of the stuff that you wanted to do in the lab, you'll have opportunity to do that in skill and speed class with me next semester. If that is, fingers crossed, that we get to be in the lab and everything next semester. So with that, that's probably a pretty good spot for us to wrap things up for today. I really appreciate you guys being with me. It was, great to see everybody's faces out there and just to hear your voices. I hope you're all staying safe and enjoying our class sessions together. And I really look forward to hear what some of your comments are on the discussions, not only for the one on the one I opened up last week that used the flow bench, but this one here from this one here on the Engine Masters with the 2-inch versus 3 inches exhaust. This will be a fun one. So anyways, with that, you guys be good, stay safe, motor on, and we'll see you next week, okay?
I know the few of us that were working on the math equation, we didn't get to do any of the stuff and figuring
All
it
right,
out.
have a good day, everyone.
Hey, we'll see you. What did you